Um, anyway, I'm Nick Buraglio. I work for Energy Sciences Networks, which I think may have been mentioned in a previous talk by Tim. I'm in the planning and architecture group there. Part of what my duties are is to be the implementation lead for removing IPv6 or IPv4 across the Department of Energy as a whole. So I'm the lead for the IPv6 only implementation program. I'm also one of the co-chairs for the V6 Ops working group in the IETF, and I'm going to talk today about some interesting and hopefully exciting updates that have been happening within that particular group within the IETF. Now, next slide, please. Let's see. There we go. What's new? Okay. Lots and lots of changes. If you look at historical graphs showing, the last 4 or 5 years of IPv6 deployment, you'll see a fairly significant ramp up in the amount of IPv6 that exists and is in use on the global internet. So because of that, 50% of the internet traffic roughly is IPv6 now. And that means that we have to revisit some of the things that we're looking at because there's a lot of serious work going into taking IPv4 out of networks. Next slide, please. So we have to look at some things from new perspectives because we're seeing things that we didn't see before because we've removed the safety net of dual stack. And as anyone that's ever tried to do this knows, when you take away IPv4 in a dual stack network, it changes things, even when there's a NAT64 or a PLAT in the path. You exercise code paths that maybe haven't been ever exercised or tested. And we need to look at what that means for refreshing standards documentation to reflect current and future states of network operations. And I see there's a typo in my slide there. Apologies. Next slide, please. All right, so how do we end up doing that? We have to start sort of at the bottom. We rechartered the IPv6 working group. The charter for that group had not changed in quite some time. I think it had been over 10 years since that had been adjusted. So we went and we looked at, what do we need to update within the charter so that we can do a better job in the standards bodies of reflecting operational realities for people. And to that end, we want to make sure that we are addressing things like having IPv6 everywhere, universal IPv6 deployment. We want to look at the advantages and the performance details of running IPv6 versus legacy IP. We want to create service requirements for nodes and applications and refresh the ones that exist. Scott had mentioned in the previous talk, there may be some updates that need to happen to simple security and other RFCs. And I actually took some notes for that because one of those was not even on my list. And so we also want to do a lot of collaboration with other very relevant and sort of closely related working groups like SRv6 Ops, 6-man, obviously, that does the maintenance on the protocol itself, and the Happy Eyeballs group. And I think the Happy Eyeballs group in particular is one that we will be doing a significant amount of work with because there's a lot of close relationship to the algorithm that Happy Eyeballs uses and, some things that how IPv6 works within operating systems, right? Those are very tightly coupled together. So we'll be working closely with them. And that work's already begun. Next slide. There's also been some leadership changes within the V6 Ops working group. The longtime chairs are now replaced by myself. I've been in there about 2 years, so relatively new. And Ziping Zhao, who was the chair, was added as a third chair right before I started. Ron Bonica, who was a longtime chair of the V6 Ops working group, has moved to an advisor role. And excuse me. And so the three of us are the ones, along with our ADs, that worked on creating the new charter, and obviously input from the other working groups. So some changes at leadership that hasn't happened in quite a while either. So that was probably worth mentioning. Next slide. All right, so now down to what we've been working on. I think that a lot of this stuff I'm hoping will be relevant for folks in the room. And if there are any suggestions on things that I did not mention, let's talk about them at the end. But essentially, what we've been working on is publishing informational documents that identify obstacles to IPv6 deployments and IPv6 operational issues. These are the most important, in my opinion, to me, because the more we work on how to deal with the problems of deploying IPv6, the easier it will be to sort of figure out workarounds for those and how to solve those problems for people that haven't done it that still need to. We are working on publishing a study that compares performance of IPv4 versus IPv6. I'm personally involved with this one, and I think that this is also going to be important for advocating for larger deployments of IPv6 once it's published. We also want to identify any discrepancies that might exist where, let's say, IPv6 does not perform as well as IPv4, or IPv4 performs, IPv6 performs better than IPv4. We want to make sure we note all those things and figure out the whys of why that is, and address any of those limits so that we can take those to implementers and vendors and everyone to help us address those issues. Next slide. All right, so we've also been working on use cases where dual stack hosts might not do the correct source address selection. They might prefer IPv4 when IPv6 is readily available. A lot of times this falls within the application layers, where maybe the applications don't understand IPv6, or they have purposely disabled it for whatever reason, and then maybe they're a legacy application and there maybe isn't a client-side address translator on the host, so there's no CLAT. It doesn't understand that it needs to use IPv6 even though it's there, and we get broken and failure and hard to diagnose states. Those are some other things we've been working on. We've also been working on advancing some informational documents to propose standards where they're warranted. There's a lot of documents that came out, 10 to 12, 13 years ago that maybe are informational or experimental or whatever, that need to be advanced to proposed standard, or if they're a proposed standard, need to be advanced to standard. And we've been actively working on migrating those to elevate their status. I'll get into a couple of those important ones here in the next few slides. Next slide, please. All right, so we've also published a handful of documents within the last 12 months. RFC 9872, recommendations for discovering IPv6 prefixes used. This one helps to sort of lower the priority of using RFC 7050 in environments that are able to do so. And RFC 7050 says if you do a DNS query and you get back this well-known prefix, activate the CLAT, inform the host that you're on a IPv6 only network. It was sort of the first mechanism used for signaling of an IPv6 only network. And it works fine. It's just there's newer methods out there that may be preferable in some cases, and so we've written a document that says in these particular use cases you should prefer using Pref 64, which is RFC 8781. So we published that document. We published 9818, which is probably particularly interesting for service providers. It allows for subdelegation of IPv6 prefix delegations to further down into the LAN network. That was published this year, and RFC 9898, which is technically not published today, but it has a number and it's in Auth 48, which is the very last stage before publication, is an informational document that details essentially almost everything about neighbor discovery and securing it. That one is a fairly long document. It's very comprehensive, and we're fairly happy with that. So, if you have folks that are sort of coming up to speed, or new people that you've hired that maybe don't have a lot of V6 experience, RFC 9898 is a good read to figure out what they need to know or have them read to learn about IPv6 neighbor discovery, which is obviously a fairly important process in using IPv6. Next slide, please. So a few slides ago, I mentioned we're taking some well-established documents and we're trying to elevate them to to a higher level. So RFC 7757 is a proposed standard. We want to advance that to a full internet standard. 7755 and 56 are proposed standard, are elevate them to or advance them to a proposed standard. Those three are all very similar. They're all related to like SIT and 464XLAT. So, originally that was released in around 2012-ish, 2013. So they've been around a long time. There's a lot of folks using them. There's no reason that they shouldn't be advanced, and that helps us to push things further into vendors. When you get to the right people within the vendor space and the sort of the implementers of these protocols, they understand, experimental versus proposed standard and standard. And so the higher they get, the more likely we are to be able to sort of push the implementations within the vendor space, which then of course aids in deployment and more people using the protocols. Next slide, please. And this one, I'm not sure how folks will feel about this one. I'm very much in favor of it, but the terminology updates to the standards. We define things within the standards process so that we can reference them later, and they're always the same, right? So it creates consistency when we create these defined terms that can then be reused. One in particular that I think is very important is the term IPv6 only, and it's also probably the most difficult of all of the terms to define officially. So we've been playing around with doing this for a little over a year. I believe there's one draft that we're going to be working on. Folks in the working group are going to be working on furthering that along. It's a little bit complicated, but like I said, it simplifies the requirements when you want to buy something, when you want to tell a vendor that you need them to implement something, when you want to define documentation for your NOC. Having these terms defined is really important. And I've personally run into issues in the 4.5 years that I've been working on sunsetting legacy IP within the DOE of having a lack of definition for IPv6 only. We had to create our own within the implementation team because it didn't exist anywhere. And so we wrote our own, and that made everything significantly smoother once we could all agree on what that definition was. So we want to make that formal within the IETF v6 Ops working group. We'll see if we can get consensus on it. But I think the long-term benefits of doing that would be quite high. Next slide, please. All right. Some more documents that we're working on. There's a lot of, if you haven't noticed, there's kind of a theme here. There's a lot of 464XLAT and CLAT work that's happening because there's more and more operating systems that are employing it, and there's more and more people that are using IPv6 only on their internal networks or external networks. But for the most part, it's being driven by client behavior. And so we're working on, node requirements that help define, what the CLAT should look like and how it should behave on end user systems. There is a document that is getting pretty close to not completion, but it's nearing the end of the steps, getting there, that helps define IPv6 mostly networks. And how to operate them, what to think about, what you need to consider when you're doing it. And that's all based on experience in running fairly good sized V6 mostly networks at the IETF, at the International Supercomputing Conference in the US, and at some RIPE meetings. So basically, we took a lot of the lessons learned and we tried to create a document that that addresses those, so folks don't have to learn the way that some of us did with figuring out what those problems were. We're also working on updates to 7084 IPv6 CPE requirements. Scott, if you're still in the room and you have some suggestions for that, I would be happy to hear them. Give it a read, and I think you'll be happy with what's going on in that space. There's also a draft working its way through the system about using dummy IPv4 address and node identification extensions for translators. Like I said, lots of work on CLAT happening right now. Next slide, please. All right. Big milestones in the future. We're pretty ambitious. IPv4 versus IPv6 performance. That's a big milestone, publishing a document that that details that, which I suspect will probably need to be revisited every 3 to 5 years. We want to formalize deployment of IPv6 in WAN environments, which I think is a pretty well-traveled environment now, but there is no documentation, there's no operational guidance around it within the IETF, so we want to create that. We want to do the same thing for data centers and for enterprise networks, especially. That is a very high priority for us, the enterprise networking one, because that's where we see the least amount of IPv6 deployment, and we want to help with that if we can. And sort of related to that, we're going to create a IPv6 in the access area network, which I think will be tightly coupled with enterprise. Next slide, please. All right, so we need more people. We need folks that are doing IPv6, that are actively working on it, or that are just interested in working on it, to join and get involved. You're welcome to bring your experience, bring your opinions, bring your conversations to the V6 Ops Working Group. I would encourage it and very much welcome it. So there's the links. If you want to get involved, you can go through the About page there. Has a lot of the same information that I just gave with regard to milestones and leadership and things like that. If you want to join the mailing list or just browse the archives, there's a list for that. I would heavily encourage folks to, if you're not already, to join the mailing list and get involved, because the more people looking at these things from the fundamental level, I think the better off we'll be further down the line. It's a bit of a long game, but it is worth it, in my opinion. And I would be happy to chat with folks publicly, privately, whatever, if they're interested, just have questions, or you want to talk about something you think we should do or something you think we shouldn't do. That's what I'm here for. So next slide. That's it. Quick. Any questions, comments? I'll be happy to take them.
Thank you very much, Nick. I'm sure you're getting a round of applause, first of all.
Oh, yeah, I see people clapping. Excellent. Thank you to the AV people for working through my not being able to share my slides, which I promised I would be able to do.
Well, thank you very much for getting us back on time. Any questions for Nick? One question.
Hi, Nick. I'm also Nick from BT. So I don't know whether this is a question or something just to reflect on. I was in a session with a vendor, popular vendor in 3GPP. We were talking about some developments around V6, and it was almost like the worst case scenario was that we'd have to go through 3GP standardization and then back to IETF standardization to do something. And we all, the group laughed as though that would be like catastrophic. But I think what was also implied was the better case would be that 3GPP could be independent of IETF. And we could go into the details of that, but I don't think that's the right answer either. Yeah, I think we must find ways to, especially around the field of IPv6, work better together in these two areas. And I wondered whether that's something that bothers you or you've got thoughts on, just to get the world of mobile and the world of IETF kind of more, the wheels more greased, working together on stuff better.
Yeah, I am in the same camp as you, that I think that it should not, I mean, we have to work together or else we'll get inconsistent behavior. And one could potentially argue, well, mobile is different, it's going to behave differently, the signaling is different and all these, and that's probably true. However, at the base level, the protocol is the same. And so I think that it's, working with 3GPP would be optimal. I will not paint a picture of speed and efficiency, because it's two standards bodies sort of working together. However, I can see him right now. Tim Chown is in the room, and he and I helped write a document that updates RFC 6724. And I believe we had to account for mobile in that one. Or was it, might have been, no, never mind. Sorry, Tim. It was the Prefer 8781 document that I mentioned. I don't remember the RFC number. I should, since I'm an author, but I don't. But essentially, long story short, the signaling for an IPv6 only network in mobile networks is generally done with RFC 7050, with DNS. There are no mechanisms for doing that with Pref 64 in some, maybe all cases. I don't know, I'm not super familiar with mobile. But because those were so tightly coupled together, we added a section in there for that, and we consulted with folks in 3GPP about some of the verbiage that we were going to use in there. So there is a communication path that exists between the two groups, and it is fairly formal from what I understand in my experience. So I do think that we probably need to do coordination on many of these things, and I would very much welcome any information you have. If you have a list of things that you think would be better handled by collaboration, that would be great to have, and we can see what we can do.
Thank you. Any more questions? One from Tim.
Tim's mad. I called him out incorrectly.
Very quickly.
Yeah, hi. Thanks. I'll just quickly emphasize, you didn't say it, but in case people don't know, to participate in the IETF, you do not need to pay a membership fee, anything. You can do it as an individual on a list and just participate and share your wisdom. The question is more, you've triggered me now on mentioning that draft we worked on together. That's now held in a pre-publication position because it references something that references something else that isn't published yet, that references something else. And it's very slow to get things through. What was your comment on actually the speed of things in the IETF at the moment and how that might be, can it be resolved?
So I have two comments on that. The first one is some things are very slow. That draft that you and I have worked on has been in progress for what, 4 years now? And it's done. It's just waiting on another reference, right? So some things, like fundamental protocol changes, tend to take a long time. That I think is on the very long end of what I would have expected. But on the positive side, I can tell you that I know of at least two, maybe three RFCs that went from a conversation over dinner, or in one case, conversation in a pub, to an actual published RFC in like 13 months. So it is possible to move, I would consider quickly, to standardize something, within the IETF if there's sufficient momentum behind it and it solves an immediate problem and there's no, unforeseen hurdles like references to references to references. So it depends on how you define quickly. Like, 6-7 years ago, I would have said a year it might as well be 100 years, right? But as I started working in the IETF, I realized that a year is actually quite fast for something. And so I think it's really a matter of perspective, but like everything in IT, I think that, it depends on what it is. The IETF, you don't have to pay to get involved. We welcome everyone. You don't have to come to any meetings. You can just be, I was on the mailing list for like a decade before I even posted, just lurking and watching and learning. But then, you also have the rough consensus aspect, which is, you need a rough consensus. And if someone is very, very strongly opposed to something, they can hold it up until you can get them on board.
Thank you. Join me in thanking Nick for that again.